Hello, class, and welcome to the course, Native American and Substance Abuse. My name is Dr. Neil Soggie, and I am your instructor for this course. This week, we turn to genetics and epigenetics. These are topics that really do require some particular care in Native health education. Historically, biological explanations have been misused to justify things like racism and harm. And for that reason, we approach genetics within a very strict scientific and ethical boundaries. As a neuroscientist and addiction scholar, I think it's important to highlight that genes do not determine destiny. Particularly when we're thinking in terms of indigenous peoples, biology must always be understood in relationship to history and culture and environment. And so when we talk about genetics, hopefully I will be able to explain a little bit about how each of these areas are equally important. And I want to emphasize that there's a gene-environment interaction rather than simple genetic causation. And so we'll explore some of that today. Within this lecture, we cover, of course, we always have a little story about somebody, and then we want to organize it into three main themes. And first, we'll clarify a little bit of the basic genetic principles and dispel some common myths about genetics and addiction. Second, we will explore some epigenetic issues and explain how environment influences gene expression. And third, we will apply these insights to substance use and recovery and help us to understand what is going on within the lives of people, particularly within those that have an indigenous historical experience and are dealing with substance abuse. We'll return, of course, to the ideas of plasticity and biological determinism and environment and safety and culture as we move through this course. But for today, we're going to focus on those three main themes. And to kind of follow along with those themes, I want to introduce you to a prominent scholar by the name of Rachel Yehuda, who is a leading neuroscientist. And whose work I think you should probably take a little bit of time and focus in on. She's worked to transform our understanding, particularly of the role of trauma in genes, particularly epigenetics. And her research has examined particularly how very severe stress and particularly severe stress in early childhood alters gene expression, particularly related to stress regulation. And she's demonstrated that trauma effects can really be observed biologically. And this is done without changing the DNA sequence. But importantly, her work emphasizes plasticity rather than permanence, that there in many ways, just because you were born into and had these early experiences doesn't necessarily mean that you are determined. It's more that your risk factors have changed somewhat. So Yehuda's studies show that a supportive environment can reverse the stress-related changes. And her work, while it doesn't focus specifically on Native populations, can be translated very easily to inform a very ethical interpretation of her research to be applied to indigenous experiences, particularly in relation to intergenerational stress, and help to explain embodied experience of addiction without having to resort to genetic determinism. So if you are interested more in this area, I would suggest that you start with some of her work and then move outward from there. Now, I'm just going to take a little bit of time and just talk basically about genes. We're not going to get into too deeply into the weeds here, but I want to kind of just cover some basics. So basically, genes are segments of DNA that provide instruction for building proteins, and they influence how our body responds to things and how our body works. It tells our body how to respond to substances, how to respond to stress, how to respond to the environment. However, and this is important, genes never act in isolation. Our behaviors, the ways that we interpret the world, also impact our behavior. So most behaviors, including substance use, are polygenic and complex, which means that there are lots of different risk factors and influences playing here. And so there isn't a single gene that causes addiction. The best that we can say, through twin studies and family studies, show that there's a modest genetic influence. And environmental context accounts for really a large portion of that risk. And so this distinction is critical, particularly in native health contexts, because there's been some stories out there that there are certain genes that cause people to be like this, and it isn't quite that simple. And so we need to kind of be careful not to misinterpret the data so that we get caught in fatalism or stigma. And we need to really kind of be very accurate with our understanding so that we can support some ethical practice. Now, the other thing I want to kind of highlight is that there is a gene-environment interaction, which means genes respond to living conditions. Things like stress, things like nutrition, psychological things like how we are attached to our parents and the kind of attachments we form, and how safety and our sense of safety influences biological functioning. These interactions explains why risk varies across contexts. The same gene variants can lead to very different outcomes. Protective environments reduce vulnerability. And this line aligns very strongly with Dakota teachings about balance and care. And so for neuroscience and from neuroscience, we can understand that regulation depends largely on context. From addiction science, we can learn that we learn a lot from our environment, and that is going to impact the kinds of choices that we make. And so a lot of these frameworks help us to kind of understand a little bit of prevention, that it isn't determinism, that environment does play a huge role in this. Now, I want to just dive in a little bit more into epigenetics, because epigenetics really kind of refers to the chemical processes that regulate gene activity. And these processes don't necessarily change the gene sequence, the DNA sequence, but what they do is they influence whether genes are turned on or turned off. And that is going to play a significant role in how we function. So stress hormones are a major epigenetic signal. So things like chronic stress alters our expression of stress regulation genes. And these genes then impact neurotransmitters and hormones, and we run on neurotransmitters. So that is going to have a profound cascading effect. And these changes can persist over time. Importantly, though, epigenetic marks are reversible. Supportive environments can normalize expression. Things like antidepressants, can go a long ways to heal neuronal serotonergic systems. And so the science is pretty clear that there is a lot of hope in recovery, that addiction isn't an inevitability, and helps also to provide some biological explanation of some of the lived experiences that people have. Now, as I mentioned, epigenetics is strongly linked with stress. So when you have trauma, what does that do? That activates the HPA axis and increases your cortisol exposure. Cortisol influences epigenetic regulation of your stress genes, which basically tells your DNA to turn on or turn off different things, that tells your brain the world is a dangerous place, which makes you feel very differently than you would if your body was telling you the world is a safe place. And this affects then emotional regulation and threat sensitivity. And such changes can increase vulnerability to substance use. However, this does not mean damage is permanent. Therapy, safety, cultural connection, all of these things help to reverse it. A sense of belonging and attachment helps to reverse it. And this is where we get into the neuroscience of recovery-related plasticity, and where Dakota practices often promote regulation naturally, where we have this convergence of strengths, of cultural grounded approaches, of care, and all of these things can bring healing to trauma and help a person to adapt and to be adaptive and flexible rather than defective. So we can kind of think of it this way. Genetic and epigenetic factors influence vulnerability, but they're not your fate. They affect sensitivity to substances and to stress. Environmental adversity amplifies the risk. So if you have a stressful life, stressful, poor communication, lots of economic stress, relational stress, all of that is going to amplify your risks of addiction. But protective factors, belonging to a community, having caring, supportive relationships, having a steady income, having a good housing, these are protective factors that can reduce it. And this explains population level patterns without stereotyping individuals. Addiction science emphasizes learning and adaptation. Substance use reflects attempts to regulate stress. Understanding the biology helps to reduce this from a moral judgment and helps us to target interventions clearly and to be supportive and compassionate and caring. So the genetic information has historically been misused against Indigenous peoples. And so for this reason, extreme care is required here. We really need to understand that biological explanations must never be racialized. Consent, sovereignty, and community control are essential. There has been some, and you will see in the literature still, that Indigenous peoples have a higher genetic risk. And I would say that's not quite accurate. It might look like that at times, but it's more, as soon as you consider the epigenetic factors and historical trauma and life stress, then it all evens out. And there isn't really this base genetic risk. So we need to kind of be mindful to not be clinically fatalistic and to be ethical in our use of research. to be able to care for the populations that we care for. Now, this has obviously some clear implications for treatment. Treatment should be target modifiable environments. It should include helping people live in safety and stability and figure out how to live in relationships, because relationships matter. Also, having and feeling like they belong to culture and have a good cultural identity buffers stress biology. When you know where you belong, you're less stressed. And neuroscience supports all of this as relational regulation. And when we apply all of these things, addictions outcomes improve because there's meaning and there's belonging. Epigenetic plasticity then supports this long-term recovery. And so when we take this perspective, it supports prevention efforts. We also, of course, need to be always thinking about trauma-informed care and working to align practices, particularly in Sistan Wapadanayate, with Dakota wellness principles, all of which goes a long way to helping the person. And so I want to just take a little bit of time and explore, just kind of summarize what we've covered in this lecture. So first off, we have genetics. This refers essentially to biological potential. It doesn't determine, it's not destiny, it's not locked in, but it tells us what we have the potential to be. Epigenetics are how the environment shapes the biology. And then when we talk about the gene-environment interaction, we're really highlighting plasticity, the fact that our biology will adjust itself to the context in a limited way, but still a significant way. And when we talk about, for the quiz question, epigenetics primarily refer to environmental regulation of gene expression. Now, in closing, I just want to kind of highlight here that genetics and epigenetics need to be considered in addictions. We don't have to be geneticists, but we need to understand that this isn't determinism. It's a risk factor. And when we think of stress and how the stress is embodied, that goes a long ways to help us understand how genes and epigenetics and addiction kind of all are mixed together, because it's stress that increases the risk. And we are born with certain genes that tell us certain ways of responding to stress. And there's basically 3 different groups of people. Some people will just not respond to stress very much, and other people are very susceptible to stress. And it's those people where the risk factor becomes much greater. So from the Dakota's perspective, we need to emphasize care and balance and restoration. From the ethical perspective, we need to understand that we need to be careful about how we use biology, that biology is not determinism, that all of what we're doing here is considering all of the polygenic risk factors for addiction and for substance use disorders. Hope you enjoyed this lecture, and I will see you next week. You take care. Bye-bye.